the political factor. In the last two chapters, we saw how the idea of a Muslim nationalism in India took birth and gradually developed into a force which can only be appeased by a division of the subcontinent into two national states. This chapter is intended to put flesh on the dry bones of the narrative so that the story of the growth of a national spirit comes alive. The historical recital will become meaningful if we take up for analysis some of the factors which played a prominent part in this development. Loyalty. The role of Muslim loyalty to the British in the formative phase of nationalism cannot be overemphasized. During the testing years which followed, the mutiny Muslims were convinced that their only salvation lay in practicing loyalty. Sayyid Ahmad Khan foresaw that the Muslim minority was no match for the progressive Hindus and that if it only alienated the sympathies of the rulers, its ruin would be complete. He brought forth many arguments from his religious study and social experience in justification of his pro-British attitude. Was Islam not nearer to Christianity than to any other religion? Did the Quran not call the Christians the people of the book and sanction marriage with them? Did the Muslims not have more in common with the monotheism of Christianity than with the polytheism of Hinduism? In the social field, too, the two God-worshipping creeds shared common ideals and practices. Both abhorred the caste system, both preached the brotherhood of man. This might have been a conscious or unconscious rationalization of his political views, but there is no doubt that Sayyid Ahmad passionately believed in the desirability, the practicability, and the necessity of a Muslim British understanding. As a Muslim, he defended it on religious grounds. As an Indian Muslim, he advocated it as a political necessity. In this mission of bringing the two peoples together, Sayyid Ahmad was helped by certain British writers who shared his views without necessarily sharing his motives. Sir William Baker, for example, brought out the close affinity between the two religions, believing in the same God and yielding nothing in respect for Christ. The Muslim among all Oriental races is the nearest to what a Protestant terms Christianity. He went further and suggested a close alliance between the English and the head of the Muslim religion, which would arouse the entire Muslim world to a pitch of enthusiasm that could hardly be understood by the English phlegmatic nature. Similarly, an English journalist found the spectacle of an English woman, she was referring to Mrs. Annie Besant, allying herself with Brahmanism is as purely unpleasant and discovered in Hinduism much that was revolting to a refined and fastidious taste. There were not many who held such strong views or expressed them in such virile language. But these sentiments strengthened the hands of those among the British who wanted to be kind to the Muslims and heartened the Muslims who were soliciting such attention. With the foundation of the Congress in 1885, the Muslims redoubled their efforts to prove their loyalty in the fear lest the Congress might be accepted as representative of all educated Indian opinion. They were alarmed by the Congress and what it stood for any advance towards self-government would imply the relegation to the position of an insubstantial minority. During the Hindu unrest of 1905-11, they supported the government unstintedly. Such deeds of faithfulness did not go unnoticed in Britain, and in 1906 the Times wrote a long leader commending the policy and sharing their apprehensions. If the forces of disaffection are active in India, it said, then it would be folly to estrange a great people who are on many grounds our natural supporters. It would be dangerous to us because of the hostile influence which may react on India from the outside world. Our only course is to show them plainly that they have not lost our sympathy, and that we value their loyalty and intelligent cooperation as much as ever. If the Indian government does not retain the confidence of loyal minorities by a steady and consistent policy, then in words recently quoted in our columns we may expect to see the Muslims either join the Congress or set up a second agitation of their own. Printing House Square was not the only quarter where Muslim fidelity was appreciated. It was then generally realized that Muslim policy had obvious benefits for England and her future. Gertrude Bell, the famous Arab, reported from India that the loyalty of Islam had not wavered in spite of a tendency among the British, resulting from the indifference born of security to regard it with less than favour, in spite, moreover, of a growing anti-foreign spirit which had been visible in other parts of the Muslim world. Another writer was in favor of encouraging the Muslims who are loyal to us lest they should be disgusted at our partiality and also turn against us. Minorities deserve honor and loyal minorities deserve double honor. The greatest test of Muslim constancy came in 1911 when the partition of Bengal was annulled. Muslim India was shocked and some leaders talked of extreme measures in retaliation. But even in the crisis, the tradition of years prevailed and the leading Muslims, though irate and indignant, instructed their followers not to agitate against the decision. The Aga Khan issued a similar appeal. It is true that shortly afterwards the entire course of Muslim politics was changed by circumstances, of which the 1911 decision was one, but prominent loyalists like the Aga Khan and Amir Ali continued to tread the path of cooperation. After the disloyal interlude of the Khilafat agitation, the old habit reasserted itself, and at the Round Table Conference, Muslims were by and large so cooperative as to evoke from the Congress the charge of being reactionaries and toadies. In 1931, just before the opening of the second conference, a striking article appeared in the Empire Review, which, along with the Aga Khan's letter to the Deccan Muslim League quoted above, stands as faultless testament of Muslim loyalty. What made it even more remarkable than the Aga Khan's letter were the antecedents of the author. It was written by Maulana Shaukat Ali, one of the famous Ali brothers who had led the Indian Khilafatists into a most virulent campaign against the British. Now, as a delegate to the conference, he made a stirring appeal for Muslim-British friendship. "We both need each other," he said. "We would grasp that hand and Islam would stand with Britain, a good and honourable friend, a brave fighter and a staunch ally. Should Hindus and Muslims live together 1,000 years, there is no chance of the two cultures merging into one. This is adamant, bedrock fact, which cannot be glossed over. No settlement that ignores this can be of any value. Wise administration requires knowledge of the psychology of races. At the back of every Muslim mind, based on our experience of the last 15 or 20 years, is the fear that Great Britain had lost something of her old virility, and that she may let us down. We want no handicaps against anybody, including the British." What lay behind such expressions of loyalty? What was the philosophy of loyalty, if there was at all a coherent thought behind it? In the preceding pages, we have referred to some of the motives that underlay this line of action. To recapitulate and add some more, it was the safest course of action for a minority which was backward and helpless. Either it could cooperate with the Hindus, which it would not, or it could keep on good terms with the rulers. To alienate both the present and the future rulers would have been folly without any mitigation. Universally characterized in the West as a militant body of persons, were the only constitutional-minded group in India. Without trying to resolve this paradox, which may have been a reaction to the unsuccessful mutiny, we must notice that the Congress was, except in the first few years of its existence, an agitational organization. Satyagraha was often made out to be a peaceful movement. But to break the laws of a country is unconstitutional, whether the deed is done by making women volunteers lie down on the road or by leading a band of mutinous riflemen. In fact, Satyagraha is more deadly, for it is planned and cold-blooded, than open agitation, which may be due to the heat of the moment. Muslims were not fond of agitating first under the influence of Sayyid Ahmad Khan and later under that of Jinnah, both of whom were of different reasons almost constitutional martyrs. I, the Muslims were skeptical both of the genuineness of the Hindu agitation and of the likelihood of its successful outcome. The agitation was for greater democracy, which to the Muslims meant greater oppression. The agitation was also unlikely to achieve its end because the rulers were strong and because all India was not on the side of the agitators. It was thus both unwise and useless to stand with the agitators and incur the displeasure of the government. Most Muslims appreciated the fairness with which they had been or were being treated by the British. Between the Hindus and the British, they chose to trust the latter and on the whole found that this policy paid dividends. In terms of religion, the Christian rulers were closer to the Muslims than were the idol worshipping Hindus. As religion was a vital factor in the awakening of the nationalism, this affinity tended to throw the Muslims on the side of the British. In social matters again, the Muslim found himself in more congenial company among the British. The two could and did intermarry, interdine, and intermix in society without disagreeable taboos. With the Hindu, one was always on one's guard against breaking some caste restriction or polluting a Brahmin household. Social mixing is as essential an ingredient of friendship as aloofness is a creator of misunderstanding. One ingenious explanation of Muslim loyalty has been suggested. The argument runs thus: the Muslims had an aloofness and a grave, stern dignity which safeguarded them against the insulting treatment of the British. Insults to them did not rankle as they did in other cases with effects which recoiled on British heads. They either retaliated or held aloof, and in any case they refused to be humiliated or to surrender their pride or self-respect. They were remarkably free from servility in contrast with the Hindus, and they entered scarcely at all into rivalry with other Englishmen or Hindus. Their conservatism kept them from it, and it appeared that they regarded Englishmen and Hindus as fitted by Providence for the discharge of functions with which they themselves did not care to meddle while they pursued the even tenor of their own way. Interesting and very intriguing indeed, but alas, only partially true. The educated among the Muslim community were greatly influenced by English literature, history, philosophy, and art. This intellectual and academic difference paved the way to political loyalty. The British ruled the country and held power and patronage in their hands. The Muslims as a minority wanted safeguards and the British alone could grant them. The Islamic injunction of obeying the ruler of the time may have weighed with a section of the Muslims. Disobedience to those in authority is not permitted unless the ruler interferes with the religious rights of the Muslims. Britain was the greatest Muslim empire in the world and had intimate relations with all independent and semi-independent Muslim states. As the Indian Muslims formed a part of the world Muslim community, it was in the fitness of things that they remained on good terms with Britain. Imperial pride. The Muslims had come to India as conquerors and had established an empire which lasted for hundreds of years. This factor molded their outlook in many ways. If we compare the Muslim invaders of India with the British invaders, we find one momentous difference. The Muslims come as alien conquerors but permanently settled down in India. Unlike the British, they did not come from a mother country to which they could look back or return after doing their spell of duty. They made India their home and this revolutionized their outlook. They became a part of India just as India made them a part of herself. The interaction had good results as well as bad. It precluded the possibility of a Muslim withdrawal and this distinguished Muslim rule in India from such recent phenomena as the behavior of the British community in India, or the French colons in Algeria, or the Belgian miners in Congo. It also made the Hindus realize that they could not get rid of the Muslims, for by the passage of time the latter had ceased to be an alien element of the Indian population. But at the same time they remained a distinct group and refused to become a part of the Hindu tradition of the country. Imperialism and pride go hand in hand. In India, their imperial past produced among the Muslims a pride bordering on vainglory. Pride is not altogether a bad thing, but when it survives the actual loss of power, it creates an unhappy state of mind, both in the individual and in the community. When Muslim hegemony was gone and real power lay with the British, the Muslims would not could not forget that they had once ruled over the land. Their reaction was bitter and truculent. The bitterness led to the 1857 revolt, which was an unsuccessful attempt at regaining the past glory. It failed, and this added frustration and humiliation to the bitterness. The truculence gave birth to an anti-British and anti-Western feeling, which kept the Muslims away from everything associated with the mainstream of progress. They were reluctant to learn the English language, to send their children to government schools, and to prepare themselves for public services under the British. They clung to their old ways of life and lost a golden opportunity of advancement. The Hindus, on the contrary, made the best use of the chance offered and captured the public services which a little before had belonged to the Muslims. During this period, the Hindu and Muslim mentalities exhibit a strong contrast. The Hindus had been a subject race for centuries. They were trained in the art of honoring the rulers. When a Muslim sat on the throne of Delhi, they learned Persian and cultivated the graces of Mughal court life. When a British viceroy governed the country, they learned English with equal diligence and entered government service with alacrity. For them, the change was not revolution. One alien invader had succeeded another. For the Muslim, the change was cataclysmic. He had been dethroned, and he did not find it easy to reconcile himself with the new times. He retracted into his shell and brooded, and this did not help. It was perhaps a natural result of the disaster that had overtaken him, but it was also very stupid and played havoc with his future. He never made up for what he had lost in those years, and later paid a terrible price for this short-sightedness. The Muslim pride vis-a-vis the British thus led to insularity. This pride vis-a-vis the Hindus led to an anti-democratic movement. The Hindus were the subject race, the Muslims were or had been the ruling race. How could the condemned masters now allow themselves to be ruled by ci-devant slaves? The Hindus were in the majority, but that did not mean that they should be the sole rulers of the country. The principle of the rule by majority could not apply to India. Democracy was therefore rejected completely, finally, irrevocably. No matter what happened, the majority shall not rule the country. If a choice had to be made, British imperialism was preferable to native democracy. Gradually, this line of thought led to the concept of nationalism. If democracy was a good thing, as all the world said it was, and if India also was one day going to get it, well, then India was not a nation. It was a continent and it contained many nations. Anyway, the Muslims were a nation by themselves and would rather live in a poor small Muslim country than in a rich large Hindu subcontinent. Another result of the imperial pride was that Muslims refused to be absorbed by Hindu polity. Brahmanism had a magnificent record of accepting into its fold diverse races and creeds, which had traveled to India in search of food or fame. Islam was the first foreign element which refused to be merged with the Brahmanical polity. It was too individualistic, too stern, too personal a religion to be so treated. It was a way of life, not a mere set of spiritual principles. Further, it had come to India primarily to spread its own creed, not to compromise with the heathen. This prevented a merger or even a concord. It was the first failure of Hinduism and the first fundamental breach in the Indian spiritual tradition. Islam is itself as a distinct entity and retained the separateness till the end. A nation could not be born when two opposing forces of such magnitude confronted each other like desperate gladiators. One byproduct of Hinduism-Islam conflict was that the Brahmanical polity was safe from dissolution, or at least from adulteration. Had the two religions come together and borrowed from each other, both would have lost something of their uncompromising purity. But the lack of such contact safeguarded Brahmanism from what the orthodox might have considered pollution. Extraterritorial attachment. Though the Muslims had made India their home and had no intention of leaving it, yet they looked out of India to recover their Arab, Turkish, or Persian roots and retain their pride as former conquerors. Their origin was alien, and so were many of their associations and attachments. The future of the Ottoman Empire was an important determinant of Indian Muslim politics from the last quarter of the 19th century right up to 1923. European ambitions of controlling Muslim countries like Persia and Egypt agitated Muslim India and conditioned her attitude to Britain, the only European country they knew at first hand. As we will see in a later chapter, events in Turkey, Persia, Egypt, Morocco, and Palestine have at times decisively influenced the course of Muslim politics in India. Religion was the most obvious, in fact, the only bond between Muslim India and the outside Islamic world. After losing their hold over their own country, the Indian Muslims derived a vicarious satisfaction from the existence of other Muslim states in the world. It gave them confidence and a feeling of security. They felt that they were not alone and friendless in a hostile world. Every addition to the community of Islamic nations was an accretion to their strength. Every Muslim country which went under was a blow to their self-respect. Though they could do little for their co-religionists outside India, they never made a secret of their sympathy for them. On one occasion, at least, their sympathy went beyond formal expression and achieved a signal success. The Khilafat agitation in India and the endeavors of the Aga Khan and Amir Ali forced the British government to replace the Treaty of Sevres with that of Lausanne. In contrast to this extraterritorial affinity of the Muslims, the Hindus had no problem divided loyalties. They had their roots in India. Their religion, their traditions, their history, their philosophy, their literature, all were Indian in origin, molded in character. There were no Hindu states outside India to divert their attention from their nationalist struggle. They did not derive their political sustenance from Hindu sovereignty in foreign lands. They never quarreled with British foreign policy since no Hindu interests were involved in international diplomacy, and therefore they were justified in taunting the Muslims with extraterritorial loyalty, though there was only a modicum of truth in the charge that the Muslims' lukewarm interest in Indian nationalism was traceable to their preoccupation with Muslim interests outside India. But the strength of Muslim concern for the welfare of the Islamic world community cannot be denied. It had serious repercussions on their political activities in India and was at times an additional reason for their alienation from the Hindus. Some Hindu leaders successfully persuaded their followers to believe that the Muslims of northern India might one day join forces with the Afghans and overrunning parts of India and founding another Muslim empire in the country. There is no evidence to show that this was ever contemplated, but it is apparent that some Hindus suspected the Muslims of harboring such designs, and this misunderstanding did not encourage communal amity. Indian nationalism and Hinduism. Indian nationalism has long been a Hindu nationalism in a sense. The Maratha Empire, the earliest manifestation of this spirit, was a revival of Hindu nationalism against Muslim domination. The earliest political bodies were Hindu even in their designation, e.g. the Sarvajanik Sabha of Pune and the Mahajana Sabha of Madras. In 1882, Dayananda founded the Cow Protection Society, which was an overt anti-Muslim gesture. In the beginning, the Arya Samaj was more religious than political, and it was one of its foremost leaders, Lala Lajpat Rai, who frightened the Hindus of the Punjab with the bogey of an Afghan invasion to be staged in connivance with the Indian Muslims. Swadeshi, the chief instrument of the Indian National Congress, was essentially a Hindu concept. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the Bengali Hindu novelist who is generally claimed as one of the fathers of Indian nationalism, assiduously propagated anti-Muslim ideas in his popular stories. He consistently treated the terms Hindu and Indian as synonymous. There is no context in which Indians can be interpreted to include Muslims. Muslims were not Indians, they were aliens. They were always cast in the roles of oppressors and tyrants. The references made to them are frequently sneers of contempt, and there are no grounds for supporting this attitude to be other than the result of a deliberate choice. The nationalism founded and nurtured by such writers could only be Hindu in character and content. This brought a new unity and national pride to the Hindus, but it instilled in the minds of the Muslims suspicion and fear which subsequent events did not eradicate. Nothing illustrates the Hindu character of Indian nationalism more faithfully than the agitation carried on against the partition of Bengal between 1905 and 1911. Religion and politics were combined in a good measure. Surendranath Banerjee, the foremost Congress leader of the time, wrote to one of the leaders of the agitation to organize a religious ceremony such as Shakti Puja, worship of the Hindu goddess Shakti, and Kali Puja, worship the Hindu goddess of destruction Kali, and to have a Swadeshi Katha or Jatha, a boycott meeting, give a religious turn to the movement, he said. And as for the Muslims, if you can get them to your side, why not have a waz, an Islamic sermon, followed by Swadeshi preaching? A Bengali Hindu who was a young man when Bengal was partitioned confirms that Swadeshi was essentially a movement of Hindu revival. Apart from the general trend of the age, the one person who was responsible for the inoculation of Hindu orthodoxy into the nationalist movement was B.G. Tilak. Very early in his career, he discovered that a religious fervor must be induced into politics if a missionary enthusiasm was to be created. He knew that once the spiritual and religious springs of India's great past was revitalized, the greatness and glory of her future were assured. He idolized Shivaji, the Maratha chieftain who had murdered the Muslim general Afzal Khan through deceit. He established anti-cow killing societies to stop Muslims from sacrificing cows on Eid al-Azha. He appealed to the people to turn out all foreigners from India, and he included the British as well as the Muslim in that category. He certainly succeeded in making the nationalist movement strong and potent, but at the same time alienated all Muslims. When the Dhaka Anushilhan Samiti was first proscribed in 1908 for its seditious activities, more than a dozen copies of the Gita, the Hindu Bible, were found among its effects, and it was found that regular Gita classes were held there. Members of the society were required to take oaths with a sword and a copy of the Gita on the head. At the height of the agitation, Sir Valentine Cairol visited India and found in every government office and in every profession that Hindus were banding themselves together against their few Muslim colleagues. On Muslim refusal to join the Swadeshi movement, words had been passed round in all big cities among the Hindus not to deal with the Muslim shops and not to trade with Muslim merchants. Where Muslims were excitable, the Hindus challenged them so that intervention by British troops should lead to the shedding of Muslim blood and thus drive the Muslims themselves into the agitation. The Bande Mataram song was a Hindu revolutionary poem occurring in Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novel Anand Math, The Abbey of Bliss, which invoked divine assistance against the Muslims and the British and roused the people to drive both out of India. This song, obviously distasteful to the Muslims, was made a sort of a national anthem by the Congress and was sung not only at all its meetings but also at the opening of legislative assembly sessions in the Hindu provinces when the Congress was in power during 1937 to 9. Despite Muslim protest, it continued to be the Congress song till 1947. Many impartial observers can be quoted in evidence of the Hindu character of the Congress. A former general of the United Provinces called it the political organ of Orthodox Hinduism. It made its appeal to Hinduism and worked for a Hindu India. Muslims rejected Gandhi's idea because he based the development of India on the cultural background of Hinduism and Hindu ideology. He took some of the religious terms of Hinduism and gave them a political meaning so that political doctrines were clothed in the phraseology of spiritual conceptions. Nationalism was presented in the Hindu garb when the ultimate goal was named Ram Raj, the golden age of Hinduism. The hold of Orthodox Hinduism over the Congress was brought out when Mrs. Besant and Gandhi were turned out of the Congress the moment they insisted on social reform and the abolition of untouchability. Well-known Hindu writers have admitted that Hinduism was the bedrock of the nationalist movement. From the end of the 19th century onwards, says K. M. Panikkar, Indian nationalism had two aspects, the one political, the other religious. The nationalist movement was religionized and was treated as a transcendental philosophy, rather than a mere political program. The basis of this philosophy was that there is a great power at work to help India and that the nationalist leaders were only acting on its bidding. In the words of a historian, of nationalism, this politico religious philosophy was meant to give the nation clear ideas about the conception of freedom. It stressed Hinduism and defended it as the symbol of Indian nationality. Evidently, such a nationalism, because of its Hindu roots and Hindu outlook, could not appeal to the Muslims. Of course, there were a few Muslims in the Congress, and for a time it also attracted large Muslim groups, but that was owing to peculiar circumstances, which we will discuss later. Most of the groups which acted in liaison with the Congress or shared its ideas took care to retain their individuality. For instance, the Red Shirts, the Arars, the Moments, and the Jamaatul Ulama were independent political parties existing in their own right and never merged with the Congress. It is necessary to emphasize that they shared only the Congress' political objective, idealist independence from the British, and not the underlying nationalist philosophy. To the masses of the Muslims, the Congress never presented a program which could win their allegiance. The presence and influence of a handful of Hindu liberals did not suffice even to enable it to save appearances. Altogether, Hinduism was far too deeply embedded in the Congress either to be explained away by its leaders or to be ignored by the Muslims. Principally, there were three ways in which the Hindus or the Congress could have dealt with the Muslim problem: toleration, discrimination, coercion. The Congress might have treated the Muslims on an equal footing, tolerated their existence, acknowledged their separate status, and honestly tried to meet their wishes. This is how Britain and to some extent the United States have dealt with their minorities. But the Congress refused to adopt this method. Again and again, its leading figures denied the very existence of the Muslim problem, blamed the British for creating this rift, and right up to the end, ignored or grossly underestimated the strength of the Muslim feeling. Discrimination is another method of dealing with minorities. They are tolerated but only as an undesirable nuisance. They are permitted to carry on their functions, but only under handicaps. In political terms, they are not given full rights. Socially, they are made to labor under serious disadvantages, like inferior schools, special institutions, separate working rights, and segregated quarters. This is characteristic of the South African government in relation to the black population. This was also characteristic of the Ottoman Empire in relation to its European and Arab minorities. The Congress practiced discrimination particularly when it was in office in the provinces. The third method is plain coercion, whereby the will of the majority is imposed on the minority. The Congress used this method when, for example, it ordered the use of Hindi in place of Urdu, or opened the legislative proceedings by the singing of Bande Mataram, or obliged the Muslim students to worship Gandhi's portrait, or lay down the Varda scheme of education. Politically, it tried to override the wishes of Muslim legislators by ignoring the opposition and by getting its will imposed on the provinces through laws passed on the strength of brute majority. The Muslims feared that in a united India they would be confronted with the discrimination and coercion, and this was the principal factor behind the demand for a separate state. They did not trust the Hindus, and where there is no trust, there is no cooperation. And where there is no cooperation, there is no national spirit. It is in this sense that the Congress is to be held responsible for the creation of Muslim nationalism and ultimately of Pakistan. To express the same thing in a different way, we may say that the Congress was too westernized. It was not true to the spirit of Indian culture, which has always striven to absorb rather than alienate foreign elements. In the long course of Indian history, many streams of race and sect have flown in from outside and gradually found a place in the waters of the Ganges and the Jamna. The Huns and the Sakas, the Parsis, and many others became a part of India and lost their cultural and political identity. But not so the Muslims. One reason for this was their large number. Another was the nature of their creed, militant, stern, and individualistic, of which India had no precedent. Still another was their membership of the world community of Islam, but above all, the failure was due to the Hindu determination that the rule of the majority must prevail. The separate personality of the Muslim community was not respected, nor was a modus vivendi fashioned whereby it could be led into cooperation, and ultimately perhaps into absorption. Instead, the Congress altogether denied its existence and at times tried to destroy its individuality. But the result was the opposite of what was expected. The community became a nation, and an affected nationalism burst into two opposing nationalisms. A policy of toleration, even of amiable neutrality, might have achieved different results. Hindu-Muslim rift. Though the Congress and most Hindus denied the existence of the communal problem in India, the problem remained and in the end created an unbreakable deadlock. Unpleasant realities could not be wished away by verbal denials. Hindus and Muslims were only kept together by the bayonets of the Pax Britannica. So deep-rooted and universal was the alienation that in Ludhiana, in the Punjab, Muslims petitioned the lieutenant governor for Englishmen to replace the Hindu personnel of the administration, and in other town they erected an ark for his honor with the inscription, "For God's sake, save us from the rule of our fellow countrymen." No more impartial witness can be called than Ramsay MacDonald, who was not only a friend of the Congress but was actually invited to preside over its annual sessions. He found Indian nationalism shot through and through with Hinduism. No Muslim can enter its holy of holies, where politics are transfigured by the presence of gods into religious faith, and where the struggle of civic freedom is transformed into the worship of Hindu genius. An American visitor of the same period found the Hindus and Muslims locked in a deathless antagonism, and the equilibrium maintained only by the virile fighting qualities of the Muslims. It is a far distant day, he wrote wistfully, that will witness the final unification of the jarring elements of the Indian population. India as a nation is as yet the most shadowy of dreams. It was in fact widely realized that the continuance of British rule in India was owing to the fact that the Hindus and Muslims were disunited. In 1908, G.K. Gokhale, the Congress leader, told Wilfred Scurvin Blunt that Muslims were all against the Congress and would constitute a danger in any reconstruction of India on a national basis, because though much less numerous and less rich, they were united. Blunt asked him if his Blunt's appealing to the Muslims to join the Congress would do any good, but was told that it would not do. Sometimes it is said that the Hindu-Muslim problem was of late growth and that the two peoples had been peaceably living side by side for 1,000 years. But this overlooks the fact that Muslims had come to India as conquerors, and that as long as they occupied that position, the Hindus dared not show their enmity. When they ceased to be the rulers, the antagonism burst out. And with the passage of time, as the immortality of British rule came to be doubted and the prospect for self-government became brighter, the Hindu-Muslim rivalry increased. The greater the advance towards democracy, the brighter the hopes of the Hindus and the deeper the fears of the Muslims. The more sanguine became the hopes of the Hindus, and the more freely they quoted the Hindu philosophy as the basis of Swaraj, the greater the apprehension of the Muslims that independence would end in merely exalting the horn of Hinduism. The distance which separated the Hindus and the Muslims from each other in politics came out in full gravity at the Round Table Conferences. All delegates were united on one demand, that India be given her independence, but beyond that not a single item of agreement was visible. Each delegate had, as the Manchester Guardian nicely put it, a dual role. He is a nationalist longing for the time when India has self-government, believing that the time has now come for her to have it. And he is a Hindu or a Muslim eager to do the best he can for his own religion. As nationalists, the delegates are at one. As Hindus and Muslims, they are rivals, suspicious and afraid of one another. The conference failed, not because the British were wicked imperialists who wanted to keep India always under the yoke, but because, as Lord Birkin had once remarked, all the conferences in the world cannot bridge the unbridgeable. The spirit of Muslim separateness was admitted by the Congress itself in a curious provision in its constitution, which will, while allocating the seats for the All India Congress Committee, prescribed that as far as possible 1/5 of the total number of representatives shall be Mohammedans. In as late as 1946, a semi-official history of the Congress confessed that Hindu-Muslim unity was as yet a dream. It seems that the Hindus and Muslims of Indian origin carry their differences with them even after leaving their country behind. In South Africa, for example, even today, Hindus and Muslims do not belong to one party. Hindus belong to the Congress Party and Muslims to the Indian Organization. Similarly, before 1947, in Britain there was the London Muslim League, which was affiliated to the All India Muslim League, and there was the British Congress Committee, which acted under the supervision of the Indian National Congress. In the United States, also there used to be an India League, which was materially a Congress organ in the New World. Who represented the Muslims? In logical consistency with their claim that there were no Hindu Muslim differences, the Congress leaders continued almost to the end to insist that the Muslim League did not represent the Muslims of India. The Congress, they said, was the spokesman of all that was vocal in India, and that the few Muslims who opposed it were reactionaries and hangers on of imperialism. Even in its early years, Alan Hume, the founder of the Congress, was severely critical of all those who doubted the all-inclusive character of the organization and called them fossils, wanting in understanding and time servers, who hoped to be paid for their opposition to the Congress. He did not believe that the Muslim opposition represented genuine feeling. It was inspired by mischievous bureaucrats who wanted to create an artificial counter agitation. This line of argument became the standard pattern of Congress' reaction to Muslim politics. But facts told a different tale. Only a handful of Muslims chose to join the Congress, and on the whole, Sayyid Ahmad Khan's advice was heeded. Between 1885 and 1894, the number of Muslim delegates to its annual sessions indicated the extent of Muslim participation. In 1885, there were 2 Muslims among a total of 72. In 1886, 33 out of 436. In 1887, 81 out of 607. In 1888, 221 out of 1248. In 1889, 254 out of 1889. In 1892, 87 out of 625. In 1893, 63 out of 867, and in 1894, 20 out of 1163. In 1902, it was reported that Muslims were not only abstaining from countenancing the Congress but were contemplating the formation of a Muslim organization which would, among other things, hold aloof from the Congress. One contemporary observer noted that all Muslims stood contemptuously aloof from this Hindu organization. Still another found that Muslims did not support the Congress but identified themselves with the British rather than the Hindus. A large number of Muslim organizations, the chief among whom was the Central National Muhammadan Association, publicly denounced the Congress and refused its invitation to send delegates to its annual meetings. Some of these reports may have been biased or exaggerated, and some Muslims were undoubtedly with the Congress and even contributed the quota to its presidentship, with Badruddin Tayyibji and M.R. Sayani. In fairness, it must be said that the Congress was not exclusively a Hindu body, and it certainly represented a vast majority of the politically minded educated Hindu Indians. But the point is that it was predominantly a Hindu body and therefore failed to win Muslim support. On purely democratic grounds, therefore it could not be said to speak for India. Take India and Europe, bless Russia as close approximations, and then. Now, let us suppose that there came to Marseilles from various parts of Europe some hundreds of persons answering to the description of the Indian delegates give of themselves, either appointed either by open public meetings or by political or trade association. Let us suppose further that these people, though strongly opposed by large numbers of their countrymen, called themselves the representatives of various peoples of Europe and entitled themselves European National Congress. And then let us ask if the title would be considered a legitimate one. Would not an assemblage so constituted be more properly termed a debating society than either a national congress or a spontaneous parliament? With the partition of Bengal and the ensuing agitation, the Congress became even more unrepresentative of the Muslims, and it was not till the Khilafat period that it could with justification claimed the allegiance of a majority of Muslims. But here we must recall the fact that during these years of violent anti-British feeling, it was not a question of belonging to the Congress or the Muslim League but of fighting out the Khilafat issue with Britain. Both the Congress and the League stood squarely for greater self-government and for Khilafat. But still the Indian Khilafat Committee was an independent body. Though it was given full support by both the nationalist organizations, the Muslims were then with the Congress in the same sense in which the British were with the French in the Second World War. The Congress did not represent the Muslims, it supported them so completely that for a time all differences were sunk in united opposition to the British. With the passing of the Khilafat agitation, the brief honeymoon was over and antagonism burst out once again, this time with redoubled fury and with no prospects for another reunion. The Nehru report put a seal on this unfortunate discord, and peace never returned to India. The Congress civil disobedience movement of 1930 to 31 was a purely Hindu campaign, which the All India Muslim Conference declared to be an attempt by the Hindu majority to acquire dominance over the minority communities in India. The Round Table Conference only deepened the gulf and the scene was set for the incubation of separatism. In the 1937 elections, the first held under the 1935 constitution, the Muslim League won only 103 out of a total of 482 Muslim seats. But the remaining seats were not won by the Congress but by other Muslim parties or groups. Out of a grand total of 1,711 seats, the Congress won only 762, which means that the Congress could speak for less than half the total number of voters. Further, out of a total of 1,289 non-Muslim or general seats, the Congress won only 736. In other words, the Congress did not represent more than a bare majority of even the non-Muslims. Who represented the Muslims? The Muslim League had done poorly because of bad organization and lack of unity among the Muslims, but nearly all Muslim seats had gone to Muslim parties. The Congress had so little confidence in its appeal to the Muslims that it contested only 58 out of 482 Muslim seats and won only 26 of these. It is hard to understand how, in light of these figures, the Congress still claimed to represent the Muslims. The Congress was said to have polled about 1 crore 50 lakh out of a total of 3 crore 50 lakh votes, and thus was a minority party in India. It had come up against difficulties in finding Muslim candidates. In the United Provinces, the home of the Congress and the Nehrus, only one Muslim was elected on the Congress ticket, and he was returned from the special university constituency under joint electorate. The Muslim president of the United Provinces Provincial Congress Committee was defeated. With the exception of the Northwest Frontier Province, the Congress had performed badly in all Muslim provinces. The election results confirmed that the Congress held Hindustan only with an unfortunate stress on the first two syllables. The election result was a rude shock to the Muslim League. The satisfaction that the Congress had won only 26 Muslim seats was soared with the thought that the Muslim community was a house divided against itself. The League now concentrated on remedying this and on building up its strength. So successful was the determined effort that in February 1938, the Manchester Guardian correspondent in India was able to report that the Muslims have rallied round Mr. Jinnah in such numbers that the Congress has been compelled, much against its inclinations, to recognize the necessity of dealing with him as their accredited leader. There was no looking back now, and the League continued to win nearly every by-election with monotonous regularity. Between 1937 and 1945, there were 77 by-elections in the provinces, out of which the League won 55, independent Muslims 18, and the Congress only 4. Between 1934 and 1945, there were 18 by-elections in the centre, out of which the League won 11, independent Muslims 5, and the Congress only 2. If in 1937 the Congress had on its electoral reckoning represented about 5% Muslims, by 1945 it did not speak for more than 1 or 2% of Muslim India. In light of these figures, it is difficult to sustain the assertion that the Congress represented the Muslims or that Pakistan was the demand for only a minority of Muslims. Those who argued under Congress pressure that the Congress should be accepted as a mouthpiece of India and its demands should be conceded were shutting their eyes to the situation that would have developed if Muslim opinion had been ignored. They mocked the two nation theory, overlooking the fact that it was a declared belief of the Muslim League. They abused Jinnah, forgetting that he held a mandate from the largest Muslim party to act on its behalf. They protested against the Muslim veto on constitutional advance, without realizing that there were 90 million Muslims in India. They persisted in the demand that Muslims must accept democracy as understood in the West, without foreseeing that this would lead to political strife and civil war. By reiterating again and again that it represented all India, the Congress made it harder for the Muslims to share its ideals. By declaring repeatedly that there was only one brand of nationalism in India, the Congress brand, it forced the Muslims to proclaim themselves as a separate nation. Such claims created fear and hatred in the Muslim mind, and hate and fear are potent ingredients of militant nationalism. To break the monopoly of the Congress, the Muslim League proffered its own brand of nationalism. To start with, this might have been done to spite the Congress, but pretense becomes conviction as its roots go deeper. Divide and rule. One of the stock arguments used by the Congress and all other parties in support of the thesis that Hindu Muslim rift was unimportant and superficial was that of divide and rule. The argument was short and sharp. All Indians were like brothers onto each other. There were no differences among them. In particular, Hindus and Muslims were good to each other and had only occasional minor tiffs. But a rift had been created between them. The British were the villains of the peace. To achieve their selfish, sordid end, they had divided the Indians into religious groups and sided sometimes with the one and sometimes with the other. This helped them to prolong the tenure of British rule and kept the Indians quarreling among themselves rather than fighting for independence. From this proposition flowed many lines of thought. One was that the British usually favored the Muslims against the Hindus and instigated the former to oppose every advance towards self-government. An extension of this allegation was that the Simla deputation had been inspired by the British and that the Muslim League had come into being through official machinations. Another was that Hindu-Muslim rivalry could not cease unless the British withdrew. Gandhi was fond of tracing the origin of the communal problem to the presence of the third party and of declaring that as soon as the British left, peace would prevail and amity would return to this stricken land. It was also said that the divide and rule policy was useful to Britain insofar as it enabled her to plead in the international field for the necessity of her presence in India, not in British interest but in the interest of India. If the British left, India would be riven by a deadly civil war. Therefore, they must stay until the advance of education and the training in self-government had created at least a semblance of unity. All Hindu and several British writers and politicians argued in this fashion, and millions of words have been written and spoken to prove the validity of the government. But some substantial facts were ignored in this partisan disputation. Britain did not put the Muslims into India and therefore did not create the minority problem. And there is no evidence to prove that separate electorates were imposed upon the Muslims against their will or without their asking for them. Nor can anything be brought forth in support of the charge that Lord Minto or other British officials managed the establishment of the Muslim League. It is true that the Hindus condemned separate electorates in unmistakable terms during 1906 to 12, but it is also true that they voluntarily agreed to them in 1916. It is true that the Congress was opposed to the Muslim League and its general policy, but it is also true that it is parlayed, negotiated, and cooperated with it when it suited it to do so. There might have been, in fact, there were some among the British bureaucracy in India who looked amiably at the Hindu-Muslim schism and saw in it an additional prop to their imperial position. It may also be that on some occasions the British official machinery was more kind to the Muslim League than to the Congress. But by no stretch of imagination does that prove to the indictment of divide and rule. We saw when we were discussing the nature of Muslim loyalty that it was in the Muslim interest to be in the good books of the rulers. The Muslims rarely made a nuisance of themselves. On the whole, they were good subjects, cooperative, loyal, law-abiding. On the contrary, the Congress thrived on non-cooperation agitation. If in these circumstances the government tended to lean a little towards those whom it could trust. This could hardly be called a calculated satanic scheme to divide the Indians. Let us keep before our eyes the elementary fact that the British were in India as imperialist. Foreign rulers are not generally pleased with refractory subjects, and when their supremacy is in jeopardy, they are apt to use a heavy hand. By the same logic, it hardens them to find that a section of the subjugated people is, so to say, on their side, or at least not on the side of the rebels. The Muslims were in a minority, and minorities always find it wise to maintain good relations with the ruling power. Thus, the Muslim was thrown into the arms of the British by circumstances, and the Hindu did not like it and attributed it to the British devilry or to Muslim reaction or to both. He did not realize that it was at least in part his own fault if the Muslim chose to ally himself with a foreign ruler rather than with fellow Indians. Hindu Muslim antagonism was not merely religious or political, but was a clash of two separate and distinct civilizations. The incompatibility of the two peoples was certainly not the creation of the British. It may be that on occasions the British profited by this immense breach in Indian unity. They would have been more than human if they had not, but that does not amount to the assertion that they divided and ruled. Indians divided themselves and let the British rule over them.